I'm excited for tonight because this was a thought process that I've kind of been thinking on for a while. And I think that I just needed a little bit of time to kind of finalize my thoughts and to put everything together and figure out exactly where do I think that because we see standards going on everywhere. We see regulations going on everywhere. And sometimes they match up and sometimes they don't match up, right? Like we see certain assets are getting classified as one thing here and certain assets are getting classified as something else over there. But on a global scale, if these assets or these networks, these protocols are supposed to function on a global scale, there has to be some sort of a common consensus, a common language, and a standard. And the standards are really just above everything else. You know, like you have the standards are in place, and then you'll see the BIS, the IMF, the WEF, they follow those standards, and then they start implementing the rules, and then from there, then the governments actually start to enforce it. It's really kind of just like a ladder. It's a stepping ladder. Yeah, take out that lip pillow. Yeah, I think I'm definitely fired up for this one. I'll try to kind of keep this in not such a jumbled thought process. I'll try to break this down in a way that's kind of progressive as we do go through this live. But we're going to have to start from the fundamentals and then build our way up, because some people are new, some people don't really know what standards are, some people don't necessarily understand the impact of regulations, some people may not understand what's going on with CBDCs and tokenization, and some people won't even know who SWIFT is. Some people don't know who the BRICS are, what's going on in the United States, what's going on in Asia. And all of it is really relevant. These are the things that we should be paying attention to when we want to talk about mass institutional adoption of our assets. Without these institutions coming to a global consensus and following the same rules, there's still fragmentation in the market, right? You'll still find discrepancies and disagreements globally as to how these certain things can integrate in with global with global implementations of it. But what's going on, it's definitely not loud, right? These institutions, the BIS, the BRICS, SWIFT, they're not loud about it. They typically, JB, thank you for the blue sky. Thanks for the galaxy, man. Appreciate you. They're definitely not loud about it. You know, we gotta kind of set the stage as to why do standards and regulations matter. You know, because most people don't pay attention to it. Most people don't typically want to look into it. Most people are kind of boring about it, right? It's not trendy. You really don't hear many people on YouTube or TikTok talking about standards or regulations. But it's really the catalyst for these institutions to come in and start to follow. And that is going to dictate our entire market. That's going to dictate the common play or common rule book that everyone is going to kind of agree to. And once we do have the standardization, the unification of blockchain, traditional finance, the integrating in of these two technologies, that's really when you're going to see the winners and the losers of it. Of course, it's important to pay attention to the standards, and it's important to pay attention to the regulations in just the United States alone because of how large it is. But we got to make sure that we're on the same page on a global standard, right? So what's really going on behind closed doors? Most people, you're never gonna hear about it, right? These standards committees, most people that are educating people on crypto, they don't necessarily even know that some of these committees, these technical committees, even exist. And as you guys can see right now, the entire world is kind of integrating in with the financial system, right? They're not these assets are not coming in. They're not breaking down the financial system. They're not replacing it, but they're coming in and they're completely re-architecting it, right? And I don't think most people are paying attention to it. Some people think that this mass institutional adoption is going to come in on a parade, right? Everyone's going to have a hat. They're going to be, a little all fairy and shit. Fireworks is these news, these headlines. Oh my God, pay attention to this. And the price explodes. And then, everybody's suddenly rich. But that's not how this is going to happen. That's not how real adoption happens. when not, especially not when we're talking about, global settlement, not when we're talking about CBDCs or central banks or capital markets, not when trillions of dollars ride on every decision that they make. There's not going to be a big news title about it. These big changes come with mountains of paperwork, right? Paperwork's for standards, regulations, frameworks. They have all these different working groups. They're testing these technologies, and they're doing these pilots in secrecy, pretty much almost in secrecy. Not when they're doing these technical upgrades. They're not loud about it. And this new financial system is being built in silence. It's not being built in front of the public. Not when trillions of dollars are going to ride on these decisions. And I think by the time that most people actually start to pay attention to the decisions that they really made, it's going to be too late, right? So I'm calling this the silent war. This is the silent war of standards and regulations. And I ultimately believe that the unification of standards and regulations are going to lead to that mass institutional adoption. This is going to, and the reason I say war, the reason that I say that it's a war, it's literally not a war with armies and militaries, but it's a war with rule books. It's going to be a war over who sets the standards, who writes the rules, who is going to define the rails, who controls the interoperability, who controls the messaging, who controls the identity, who controls the liquidity, who is going to control the settlement. That's the war that's going on globally right now. In finance, and this is in just a very broad sense of it, right? The ones who control the standards controls the system. It's not the tech companies. It's not the token price. It's not the fastest blockchain. It's not the decentralized community. It's never the loudest advertisers or marketers. The standards control everything. Like HTTP, that's the standard for the internet. That didn't win because it was fast. It won because everyone agreed to use it. TCP/IP didn't win because there was like memes behind it. It won because it became the rule for everyone to utilize. The internet didn't just work because somebody invented websites. It worked because everyone built on the same protocol. And money is kind of coming into that same phase. They're building this permanent vision, this permanent vision as to how should money operate in, and you have blockchain integrating in with it. The banks, they're not ignoring blockchain anymore. They're integrating in with blockchain. The central banks, they're not ignoring blockchain anymore. They're tokenizing money. These legacy networks, they're not dying, right? Swift is not going anywhere. They're upgrading some of these systems. And most importantly, these standards, they're not optional. They're mandatory. These standards become mandatory. Every country, every institution, every infrastructure provider wants their version of the standard to win. That's the war. That's really the war that's going on. It's not prices. It's the war of standards and regulations. This war is going to decide what blockchain architecture becomes acceptable and normal. It's going to decide what interoperability layer becomes universally accepted. JB, thank you. This war is going to decide what messaging format becomes a global language. This war is going to decide what settlement networks become the backbone for finance. This war is going to dictate what regulatory model becomes global frameworks. What nations are going to lead, which nations are going to follow, who's going to control the liquidity, who's going to request access, who's going to request access to this liquidity. And people are missing it because they're watching the price instead of paying attention to the policy. The institutions are looking at compliance. Retail is focused on God knows what. Retail's asking, when is this coin going to pump? When's this coin going to pump? You really should be asking, what rails will the world be forced to adopt? That's what you should be asking yourself. Because when those rails actually finalize, when those standards unify, right? When the regulations actually start to synchronize in with one another, when that interoperability becomes frictionless, it's not what meme coin was the best one. It's going to be only the networks that were aligned with the global rulebook are going to survive. And I'm going to give you guys examples of these rulebooks, these standards and regulations. They're almost done. They're almost done with it, right? The puzzle pieces have been put together, right? It's already in motion. You have ISO standards, right? You have global blockchain standards. You have CBDC frameworks. You have interoperability protocols. There's regulatory global alignment going on right now. You have these payment rails. They're modernizing, right? Cross-border pilots. There's liquidity networks, interoperability. I mean, all of these, right? These governments, they're not taking a shot in the dark. These governments aren't guessing. You know, the banks are definitely not gambling. And these institutions, they're not sitting on their thumbs. They're not procrastinating. They know exactly where this is going because they are the ones that are building this. This is much bigger than just, let me jump into this liquidity pool. Crypto is now starting to align with standards, and that's how that's going to unlock institutional adoption. And when they finally do come in with standards and regulations, you're not going to get a warning. Your Coinbase isn't going to send you an alert saying, hey, pay attention to what just got passed. Nope. You'll just wake up one day and everything will just be integrated in. So when we talk about the silent war, this is not a war that's fought with, armies. This is a war that is fought with pens. This is mountains and mountains of paperwork. This is a war that's fought with regulations, not tanks. This is a war that's fought with standards, not human lives. So I'm going to try to break this down for you, piece by piece. And the first one that I'd like to start on is the ISO standards, right? TC 68, TC 307, 222. So before the institutions actually adopt anything, before the governments approve to onboard with anything, and before the liquidity even moves anywhere, the world needs a rule book that everyone is going to abide by, right? Everyone has to play by this rule book. And this is honestly where I think most retail investors in crypto have no idea what's really going on. They think that speed wins. They think that the decentralization is going to win. They think that the hype is going to win. They think that the narratives are going to win. But legacy finance is not paying attention to any of that. That's not at all what winning is going to look like in terms of legacy finance. The ones that are going to win in terms of the institutions and the eyes of the institutions, it looks like the onboarding of standards. It looks like the onboarding of compliance. It looks like the alignment across, hundreds of nations with thousands of institutions inside of these nations. So this is going to bring us to really the connection of different ISO bodies. And I think that these ISO bodies in coordination with one another are going to kind of be the foundation for this new digital economy, right? We've talked about 222, but some people still have no idea what that really means. Nobody understands TC 307, and even less people even understand what TC 68 is, but little do they know that TC 68 actually sits above all two of those. So ISO TC 68 is a technical committee. It's a group that's responsible for financial service standards. Okay, they basically set like a global rule books for how banks are going to operate, how payment systems are going to work, how digital currencies can be structured, how financial data is going to get handled from financial market infrastructures, how risk is going to be managed across borders. If anything in the financial world gets connected, you better believe TC 68 had something to do with it. Okay, and then from ISO TC 68 actually came in ISO 222. right? 222 is not a blockchain standard. It's not a token standard. It's not a crypto certification, but it's a messaging format. It basically tells financial institutions exactly how the information has to be formatted and how it has to look when the money actually starts to move, right? So they're really focusing on like structure, the data, the compliance information. It's the way that payment messages are constructed so that every bank all across the world and every clearinghouse system can read these financial messages without there being confusion and there being days of reconciliation. So banks are using ISO 222 as a way to speak in the very same way that computers kind of use TCP/IP. It's basically the language for money. Now, because you have these messaging standards, right, you need infrastructure standards so that those messages can actually run on digital rails. So this is where your ISO TC 307 actually comes in. So TC 307 is the group that's responsible for blockchain and distributed ledger standards. Yes, the same thing that you're invested in, blockchain, this is the standard for your industry, all right? They write the rule books for how blockchains operate, how identity works within blockchains, how consensus is supposed to be structured, how privacy is going to be controlled, how interoperability can actually function, how these smart contracts can become legally enforceable. So ISO 222 is responsible for the communication or the messaging. TC 307 handles the actual execution of these. But neither of those standards are kind of in their own lane, right? TC 68 and 307 basically come together, right? It's the financial world and blockchain. They're designing these standards together. And they're not designing these standards after the adoption. They're designing these standards before this mass institutional adoption, which means that the new financial system is not crypto's coming after the banks. No, it's not. That's not what that means. It means that the banks and the standard bodies are integrating in with blockchain, and they're kind of reconstructing this into something that's compliant, into something that's global, into something that is unbreakable. We have to pay attention to the infrastructure because this is what they're paying attention to. We're not waiting for the institutions to adopt the blockchain, right? That's not what we're doing. But we're watching the institutions rebuild blockchain into their own format, and we see this on a global scale, right? ISO is building the networks for the settlement, okay? And traditional finance and blockchain, they're coming together. We've already seen it. And when that dust settles, we're not going to have thousands of blockchains. We're not. We're going to have a few standards. We're going to have ones that are built according to the ISO rulebook. We're going to have some of them that are capable for holding global liquidity. That's really where we're heading. And retail is, I mean, we're still arguing about what chain is the best. What's the fastest? You know, I could develop meme coins on here. Institutions are spending years. They've spent years deciding which architecture is safe enough to standardize. And look around. You could see this. This is happening on a global scale everywhere you look. You have all these payment rails. They're switching to ISO 222. These banks are modernizing their messaging formats. You have CBDCs that they're being tested and actually rolling out. Tokenized bonds are even being tested. Central banks are piloting settlement networks. That's a big one. That's a really big one. You have cross-border frameworks. They're being tested and trialed. This isn't like let's see where it goes. No, this is a coordination. You know, this is a means to standardize digital money. Okay. ISO blockchain standard, that's ISO TC 307. But it's relevant because ISO 222 didn't just pop up out of nowhere. TC307 wasn't created because someone was, bored, and TC68 isn't kind of just like, oh, I don't know what's going on, I'm sleeping. No. But together they're building the frameworks that every nation and every institution is going to plug into. They're going to have to plug into. This is crazy because the crypto market is trying to, build adoption and build price appreciation through speculation, but the real adoption is coming through standardization. Standardizations is a means that you can use to measure the adoption. And when 222 tells the world how to move, how money is going to talk, when TC307 tells the world how digital rails are going to work, when TC68 is kind of overseeing financial compliance, together you get this foundation for a unified global financial network. And when these three actually fully interlock with one another, the movement, the movement, right, the settlement, the messaging, and the regulatory standards, something big is going to happen. That is going to be when the real money starts to move. Okay? That's going to be when your CBDCs start to scale into the trillions of dollars. That's going to be when your tokenization scales into the trillions of dollars. That's going to be when your entire market is migrating on chain. That's going to be when the banks are no longer testing, but they start to deploy. That's going to be when the world finally upgrades. It's just going to be like that. It's not going to be like a headline. You're not going to see it on Fox News or CNN. You're definitely not going to read about it in the the papers. It's gonna. This is going to be big. The adoption is not going to be loud, but it's gonna happen in increments. And this is the biggest shift in monetary history. And you're only going to benefit from it if you have the foresight and the patience to pay attention to it while it happens. This is why it's a silent war, because it's happening at the standards level, not at the speculation level. It's not loud. The winners aren't getting chosen by, votes from retail. The winners will be chosen from compliance. And those who understand the standards, they're going to recognize which networks survive 10, 20, 15, 30, 40 years. So now I'd like to go a little bit into the BIS, the IMF, the World Economic Forum, and the World Bank. So we know that 222, TC307, and TC68 are basically the blueprint. And we're going to talk about the architects that are actually enforcing this blueprint. Okay? Because the standards alone, they don't move the world. Somebody has to push the standards. Somebody has to organize all of the nations. Somebody has to set the deadlines and encourage the migration and fund the pilots and get the banks on board. Somebody has to do that. Okay? And it's not crypto. It's not me. It's not you, retail traders. It's the global institutions at the top of the financial food chain. Again, it's the BIS, the IMF, the World Economic Forum, and the World Bank. And they're not just these global organizations, but they are rule makers. These people are making the rules. When they talk, central banks listen. When they announce frameworks, governments are paying attention. When they run pilots, countries are following them. And when they set the directions, the standards follow. Most people in crypto have no idea how much power these groups actually have. So let's go through the BIS, guys, right? The BIS is basically the central bank for central banks. They decide how money moves between nations. Okay, they decide how settlements are going to work. They decide what CBDCs look like. They decide how cross-border systems actually get connected to one another. They also decide how much risk. They control the risk, and they're not out here throwing a dart in the dark. They're not. They're running these projects right now where they're testing tokenization, they're testing CBDCs, they're testing cross-border networks, and they're testing interoperability. So when you hear me talk about, Project Rosalind, Project Meridian, Enbridge, Project Dunbar, Project Agora, I'm not just bringing up these random test experiments. I'm talking about these are the blueprints coming from the top of the top, the central bank of central banks, above the Federal Reserve, above the European Central Bank, above the Hong Kong Monetary Authority. This is an organization above the central banks. We're following the blueprint for the next financial system. Now we'll go into the International Monetary Fund. All right, they basically help countries stabilize currency. Right, they also fund developments. They're the ones that are really kind of pushing this digital transformation, and they're out here supporting digital currency infrastructure. They're paying attention to the infrastructure, right? And when they are out here supporting it, you better believe institutions and governments are going to move with them. The World Bank, they're responsible for development and inclusion and financial inclusion. Okay, if they recommend blockchain for a blockchain rail for cross-border aid or digital identity, you better believe developing nations are going to listen to them, especially when the funding is attached to that. If they're recommending a blockchain rail for something, you better believe nations are going to listen, especially if there's funding attached to that. What about the World Economic Forum, right? They're basically like a planning group. They're like a corporate planning group. They basically are this huge group of banks and tech companies and governments and all these different industries, and they kind of discuss a direction to move into, right? So they're the ones that are really pushing for digital identities and tokenization and green energy and cross-border rails and data governance. They're the ones that are really kind of, okay, look at what we're doing. And together, the BIS, the IMF, the World Economic Forum, and the World Bank, they are forming policies together. They're not arguing about what crypto coin is the best. They're out here describing how nations are going to transact with one another. They are helping shape the rails for central bank digital currencies. They're testing tokenized bonds and treasuries. They're talking about how interoperability is going to function across different continents. And these groups come together and they set a direction. So ISO writes the standards, the group is going to set the direction, and then the governments are going to implement the direction. It's a ladder, guys. It's an absolute, you could think of it as a pyramid as well, but it's a ladder. Retail thinks that adoption is going to come from, exciting price. Institutions know that adoption is going to come from the policies. Retail's thinking that markets will always move from speculation. But in reality, the markets are going to move from regulations. When they get that green light that they can start to adopt and integrate in with it, that's really when you get that adoption to come in. And retail also thinks that the new financial system is going to arrive in the same way that a bull run arrives. In reality, the new financial system is going to come in as infrastructure starts to roll out. It's going to happen one meeting at a time. It's going to happen one standard at a time. It's going to happen one migration at a time. It's going to be silent. It's going to be quiet behind the curtain. It's going to be slow. And then boom, the foundation is built. And that switch is going to go. It's going to look boring, but it's irreversible. Absolutely irreversible. So when we start talking about the silent war of standards and regulations, that's why we're paying attention to it. Because if the BIS is writing the playbook and ISO writes the rule book and the regulators are enforcing the rule book in each of the countries, when all three of those actually start to merge together, adoption is not optional, guys. It's mandatory. It's mandatory. They've been doing this for years. They've been doing this for years, much longer than crypto has been around, much before Bitcoin was around. If these bodies are coming together and they're shaping the entire system, what does the infrastructure that we use today look like, right? Swift, Fedwire, RTGS, the real-time gross settlements, SEPA chaps, what happens to them? Are they going to replace it? Oh my God, is XRP going to replace Swift? Are we going to abandon Fedwire and RTGS and chaps? Are we going to move away from the legacy rails and it's going to be 100% crypto? No, absolutely not. All of those are being upgraded. They're being modernized. They're aligning to the ISO messages. They are preparing for DLT compatibility. All right? So legacy rails are not dying, but they are converting. Swift, Fedwire, SEPA chaps, they're not being replaced. All right? They are evolving into ISO compliant DLT ready rails. And when it happens, it's going to be massive. You know, most people think that XRP is going to replace Swift. Fedwire is going to disappear because Hedera comes in. Chaps, SEPA, RTGS. That's old news, man. When blockchain rolls in, it's going to destroy everything. It's going to replace everything. No. The real world does not throw away infrastructure that handles trillions of dollars a year just to start over. That's too big of a risk. You're not tearing down the entire banking system. You're going to modernize the plumbing behind the walls. You know, like, think about it. Like, when they want to remodel a skyscraper, do you think that they just demolish the entire building? They throw tons of fucking C4 at the foundation and let it crumble down? No. You replace the plumbing. You replace the electrical systems. You replace the elevators when you want to remodel a skyscraper. And that's exactly what's happening to global finance right now. Swift is not dying. It migrated to ISO 222. Fedwire is not old news, right? It's moving to ISO 222. SEPA and chaps, they already moved over. RTGS systems around the world, they're coming on board. Well, why? Why are they transitioning? Why are they completely rewiring everything? Because ISO 222 is the new language of financial messaging. And once every major payment rail speaks that same language, you know what they get? Do you know what they get? They get programmability. They get interoperability. They become ready for digital asset integrations. They become ready for CBDCs. They become ready for DLT rails. That's the transformation that's happening. The world is not replacing Swift. They're just modernizing it, right? They're prepping it for the blockchain age. And ISO 222, the messaging alone, does not make money digital. The legacy rails are upgrading, but there is a new layer that is being built beneath it. And that's your blockchain DLT settlement. ISO messages are on top, but the blockchain executions are the foundation for it. So you may see like messaging upgrade. Oh, well, that has nothing to do with blockchain. Well, the institutions view that as settlement modernization. And we see this, and we see it from projects from the BIS, right? Project Rosalind, which was API access for CBDCs. You think CBDCs are what? Project Meridian is tokenized settlement experiments, right? They were experimenting tokenized settlements. Project Enbridge is a multi-country CBDC. Project Agora is wholesale infrastructure models. These are not random pilots. This is the new plumbing being tested. They're not jumping onto a chain that they haven't tested. I don't know how else to tell you this. All the legacy rails are preparing to integrate in. You know? First, you have to upgrade the messages. Then you have to plug in the new rails, which is DLT technology. And then one day, everything just works faster. The institutions don't care about what blockchains came first, what blockchains have the most transactions. You know what they care about? Who can connect to the rails that they already use? Because if your blockchain can't connect into legacy rails, Fed, Swift, chaps, it's garbage. They want to focus on what blockchains speak ISO, what blockchains meet governance requirements, what blockchains fit into compliance frameworks. That's fine. Pay attention to the charts as much as you want. That's not what the banks are paying attention to. The banks are paying attention to who has the ability to integrate in with us. And that's why chains that align with ISO standards, the ones that we usually talk about, there's a reason that they keep appearing in pilots and enterprise partnerships and custody frameworks and tokenization projects. Why? Because they fit the upgrade. Suddenly, everything is just going to go on chain. One update at a time, one migration at a time, one interoperability layer at a time. After the messaging upgrades, after the interoperability frameworks are mature, after the settlement pilots are successful, there's only one thing left, guys. The money itself turns digital. That's when your CBDCs come in. That's when your tokenized treasuries come in. That's when your regulated liability comes in. Regulated liability networks come in. That's when your wholesale settlement networks get adopted. The moment that money becomes programmable, legacy rails and DLT, your blockchain settlements, are going to merge together. That is when you will see that global institutional adoption. Because once money is digital, the countries start competing over settlement control. Right? CBDCs, tokenized money. When money goes programmable, when treasuries go on chain, when liquidity becomes digital, when settlement becomes instant, think about the competition between the nations. Think about it. Messaging rails, settlement architecture, blockchain standards. Yeah, that's important. It's foundational. But none of it means anything until you change what flows through the pipes. Because right now, legacy money is still slow. It's still clanky. It still operates like it's in the 1970s, and everyone's using a fax machine and rotary phones. The banks can message faster. The systems can interoperate better with one another. But if the money itself isn't digital, then it's like trying to suck a golf ball through a garden hose. How do you do that? How do you do that? You have to have digital money in order for that mass institutional adoption. So it's phases, guys. There are phases for it. The money itself will become digitized. And no matter how many people online want to, talk about CBDCs or how crypto is going to replace the banks, well, the main idea of crypto was to challenge the banks, and you're going to become your own banks. And it's all decentralized. Well, the people who are actually moving the money, the central banks, the treasury departments, the clearing houses, they already made their decisions. They said, we're going digital, we're going programmable, we're going on chain with settlement finality. That's your CBDCs. That's your tokenized cash. That's the treasuries, the bonds, deposits. The bridge that will connect commercial banks and central banks, that interoperability. That's what they're talking about. The BIS is running pilot after pilot. The New York Fed is testing regulated liability, the regulated liability network. Maybe it's the RSN, regulated settlement network. JP Morgan, tokenized money market funds. BlackRock, tokenized treasuries. They're paying attention to this. People still think that we're years away when the institutions are doing it right now. The institutions are doing it right now. CBDCs already are being rolled out right now. Tokenized assets, they're live right now. The interoperability tests, there's tons of them. Every major bank is kind of jumping into blockchain adoption. But sure, we're going into a bear market. The banks are ignoring blockchain. CBDCs, never. Not in this country. Meanwhile, the BIS is building the instructions for the new financial system. As if it's your father building an IKEA furniture Christmas morning. They're going through the instruction manual for a new financial system as if it was an IKEA furniture. Once you digitize the money, it's not just about speed. But they gain control. They gain power, they gain influence, and they gain leverage. That's the war. When the money becomes programmable, you can automate settlement. You can embed compliance into it. You can enforce taxes and remittances, and you can manage the liquidity. You can lock tokens. You can automate contracts. You can settle cross borders without corresponding banks. That's why your countries are racing right now. Not to adopt crypto, but to adopt the blockchain-based rails that they can control. CBDCs aren't just a tech upgrade. They're sovereignty upgrades. And once nations realize that programmable money gives them more control, more efficiency, more liquidity, less dependency on foreign rails, they're not asking, should we upgrade? They're saying, when can we do this? Where is the paper? We need to sign this now. CBDCs and tokenized treasuries and wholesale settlement networks, that's going to be that next phase. That's the competition. It's going to be competition between currencies, competition between nations, competition between standards, competition between regulatory frameworks, competition between settlement networks. When that money becomes digital, someone has to control the switch. Look at BRICS. Look at the G7, right? BRICS and the G7. Look at Enbridge and SWIFT, the US dollar. This is where the standards become weaponized and currencies become a fucking battlefield. All of this is happening because money is power. And the moment that money goes digital, every country is forced to decide who controls the settlement. Whose rails do we run on? Who is going to set the rules? Who holds the liquidity gates? And right now, the world is splitting into two major camps right now, right? You've got the Western financial side, right? The US dollar, SWIFT, the IMF, the BIS, the World Bank, the G7 economies. And then you got the Eastern emerging powers, right? You have BRICS, CIP, Enbridge. It's not just about crypto, guys. This is the currency power fight of our lifetime. The US dollar has been the global reserve currency for decades. Not because it's good money, but because the world settles through SWIFT and the dollar is utilized for liquidity. Oil, it's in dollars. Global trade, it's in dollars. The debt market, it's in dollars. Settlement, it's in dollars. But what happens when that money becomes digital and countries realize that they don't have to settle through SWIFT anymore? What happens? If they could settle value directly with one another, and they could program it, and it could be instant, and it could be bank to bank for central banks, right? Peer to peer between central banks using blockchain rails. What happens when they realize they don't have to settle through SWIFT anymore? Suddenly, you don't need the dollar to settle. You don't need Western corresponding banks. You don't need the middlemen. You can run your own rails. And that's exactly what the BRICS is doing. That is exactly what the BRICS nations are doing. BRICS nations, guys, it stands for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. BRICS. That's what that stands for. Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. And there's many more nations in there. Right? China has chips. Saudi Arabia is joining. You have Russian. They have to seek payment routes because of the sanctions the United States has put on them. India is also looking into CBDCs. The UAE is testing Project Enbridge. Africa is tokenizing trade finance. Latin America, for God's sake, is focused on CBDCs. So what is the West doing? What is the United States doing? What's the G7 doing? They say, okay, you want to do that? No problem. We'll just modernize first. And we're going to make our standards global before yours is. That's what's going on the macro scale. That's where this silent war of standards and regulations comes in. It's a war of rule books. It's a war of APIs. It's a war of interoperability frameworks. It's a war of regulatory alignment. Because whoever gets global adoption first is going to win. CBDCs are not going to be optional. Tokenization, it's inevitable. It's coming no matter what. This is why ISO alignment matters. This is why standardization meetings are happening all of the time. This is why every central bank is testing pilots. JB, I'll get you to come on in a little bit. I kind of want to finish this thought process. But this is a strategy. This is absolute strategy. The future of the governments, they're designing their own digital rails. They're choosing what compliant blockchains can actually plug into them. This is not freedom from the system. This is the new version of the system, guys. You want to tell yourself that crypto's dead? Okay, Saudi Arabia and China are testing CBDC networks on blockchain right now. Banks are never going to touch crypto. There's no adoption going on. JP Morgan literally tokenizes trillions of dollars on private ledgers. Nothing's going on right now. The governments, they hate blockchain. Why would they let us see everything that they do? 130 countries are advancing in CBDC development. The BIS is literally publishing guides to this. People are denying what's going on right now. It's the same way people deny what's the internet. Oh, it's a fad. They're just not paying attention, these people. They're not paying attention. The world is preparing for digital trade, digital settlement, digital liquidity. And the countries are racing. It's like the space race right now. This is the digital era of the space race. Because you know why? You know why they're racing for this? Whoever controls the settlement flows controls the entire economy. Whoever controls the liquidity controls the leverage. Whoever controls the rails is going to control the policy. Look at where we are right now, right? The U.S. is controlling everything, and they do it through SWIFT, and they do it through how dominant the dollar is. But in the digital era, the battlefield is wide open. It's the East versus the West. It's ISO versus the domestic standard bodies. It's the global regulations versus the fragmented silos. Interoperability frameworks versus the settlement corridors. Everyone's building their own version of the future right now. Nothing is kind of aligned, really. They may have an idea, but only one of the visions, only one of these rule books, these playbooks, are going to become the global default. Well, why? Because of the control that it gives them. Somebody needs to build the actual interoperability layer, right? The connection that makes all these blockchains and CBDCs and tokenized money, tokenized markets and legacy rails talk to each other. Somebody's got to build that. This is not a war between country and country. This is a war between standards versus standards. Private sector versus public networks. Corda and Fireblock and the DTCC and R3 Corda. This is the race to become the Internet of Value router. All right, so look at private infrastructure. Quant, Chainlink, Hyperledger. You think that I say that they're not competitors, but they're definitely designing infrastructure, right? Government versus government, central bank versus central bank, region versus region. But now comes corporations. Not random startups. These are giants. These are financial giants. Infrastructure providers are coming in. Companies that clear trillions of dollars while you guys are figuring out what altcoin is going to pump next cycle. We're talking about private sector building their rails, their interoperability layers, their tokenization frameworks. They're trying to become the backbone for this new system. This is standard versus standard. Because governments can create CBDCs, sure. Banks can upgrade to the messages, sure. ISO can define how the data has to look. But somebody still needs to build. Somebody has to build the interoperability layer. Somebody has to build the tokenization platforms. Somebody has to build the settlement bridges. Somebody has to build the execution layers. Right? Quant wants to be the universal interoperability layer. Overledger. That's their thing. As the single means for connection between multiple chains and CBDCs and banks and legacy systems. And then you got Chainlink CCIP, right? They want to be the messaging and value transmission standard across blockchains. Hyperledger wants to be enterprise DLT, an enterprise DLT tech stack, right? Supply chain, tokenization, price feeds and stuff. R3 Corda, they want to be the anchor for financial agreements and regulated assets, programmable settlement, legal contracts. The DTCC, they're tokenizing securities, right? They're developing infrastructure for that. They clear more value than the entire crypto market. They clear more value every single day than the entire crypto market. What about Finastra, right? We focused on Finastra before, but they want to be the fintech connection between banks. They have thousands of institutions connected to them. Everyone wants to be the rail, right? Because whoever becomes that interoperability layer becomes the interoperability standard. And whoever becomes the default controls everything. This isn't a layer one war. This isn't Solana versus Ethereum nonsense. It's garbage. It's distraction. This is infrastructure competing for the global licensing rights. I guess. Right? Like even your smartphones, right? Apple didn't have to be the only phone, but they had to control the ecosystem. Microsoft didn't have to be the only computer. They just had to control the operating system on the computer. Swift never moves any money, but it controls the messaging rails. Crypto thinks that it's my chain versus your chain. They think it's blockchains fighting one another. Well, the institutions know that the future is interoperability, and it's the standards, and they're fighting for that right. Because this is a world where we're going to introduce CBDCs and tokenized treasuries and digital commodities. Someone has to connect all of them. They're all out here. If anything, the interoperability is not competing with one another, but what they are competing for is integration. That's what they're competing for. They're competing for the standard, the governance right. You have governments building CBDCs. The banks are upgrading the rails. Standards are creating all these different frameworks. Mass adoption is not, oh yeah, it might happen. No, it's inevitable. It's inevitable. But we're not there right now. It's coming in pieces, but it's not here right now. Because you have all these multiple systems, they're still being built in different lanes, right? Different networks, different standards, different countries, and different approaches to certain things. What happens when public and private rails start to connect to one another across these borders? Someone has to unify them. Yes or no? This is when interoperability becomes life or death. The moment that CBDCs need to talk, the moment that tokenized markets need to settle, and the moment that liquidity has to be routed globally, there's only one architecture that could be the global conductor, the global standard. None of that matters if the world can't connect to it. If a CBDC in China can't settle in Europe, it's useless. A tokenized treasury in the United States means nothing if it can't connect and interact with liquidity pools in Asia. A bank network in one country can't scale if it's isolated from everyone else. Without interoperability, digital finance is still fragmented. So this entire transformation depends on one missing puzzle piece. Who becomes the global value router? It's not about the fastest chain. It's not about the cheapest coin. It's not about the biggest army behind it. The router, the connector, the translator, the universal translator of assets, messages, and value. That's how the internet works. Doesn't matter if it's a Samsung or an Apple, Windows or Macs, iPhone or Android, Chrome or Safari. They all connect through one shared protocol. Without that protocol, you don't have an internet. So the same thing's happening with money. Multiple blockchains exist. Multiple CBDCs exist. Multiple tokenized platforms exist. Multiple standards are being drafted right now. But there can't be 10 different global routers. There can only be one. That's how the infrastructure works. They have to become harmonized in their framework. And right now, you have a lot of different players sprinting towards the finish line. Some want to route messages, some want to move value, some want to route liquidity, some want to route smart contracts, some want to route CBDCs. The real goal is not blockchain dominance, it's settlement dominance. Right? Only one of them is going to route all of those. When liquidity needs to be moved globally, instantly, 24/7, who does the world route through? That's your $1 trillion question. If you could figure that out, my God, you might just become very, very wealthy. Scratch that. That's the $100 trillion question. People think that crypto's end game is market cap. No, the end game is the liquidity routing rights. Whoever becomes the global router, the SWIFT of this digital era, wins the entire kingdom. Why? Because money follows convenience. Haven't you figured that out yet? Haven't you figured out why Uber replaced taxis? Haven't you figured out why Airbnbs replaced hotels? Haven't you figured out why DoorDash replaced your delivery drivers? The money follows convenience. And the settlement follows the rails. The standards follow the adoptions. The adoption follows the interoperability. If you control the bridge, you control the flow. If you control the flow, you control everything. You may have all these countries, they may disagree. You have these blockchains, they may be different. The banks, they may use different systems. But when that money needs to move, it moves through the router that everybody agrees on, the same way that every website is displayed on one standard. That's the war that's going on. It's not CEOs debating. It's not influencers fighting, screaming with each other. This is the race of who becomes the default pathway. And the moment that the architecture becomes the dominant standard, everyone else is going to route through that. Just like how every browser routes through HTTP. Every email goes through STMP. Every phone connects through the telecom protocols. Right? Doesn't matter. Oh, I have an Apple, Samsung. No, doesn't matter. It's because they're universal. That's the final barrier between today and mass adoption. It's not the price. It's not the awareness. It's not the hype. It's not the bull markets. It's the interoperability. Because when every asset can talk to a ledger, when CBDCs can settle across borders, when tokenized bonds can interact with stablecoins, that's the moment that lightning strikes. That is when liquidity, routing, and settlement control really becomes the king of the hill. Legacy power, central banks, and blockchains, they're coming together. The backbone of global finance. It's the route to liquidity. They're all fighting for the same thing, settlement control. Right? Who is going to finalize the transfers? Who's going to clear the global transactions? Because you know what? Whoever controls the settlement controls the value. Whoever controls the value controls the power. I mean, look at what's going on today. Why does the US dollar dominate? Why? Chat, I'll read it. It's not because it's magic money. It's not because it tastes better than the euro. It's not because it's morally superior. It dominates the world because the world settles trade through the US dollar. Oil, commodities, shipping, cross-border transfers. Almost all of them clears in the dollar. Settlement is the influence. Influence is your leverage, and your leverage is your control. So now that digital money is coming in, that system, it's up for grabs. It's a reset of the settlement rails. Every country wants in, every bank wants a piece, every blockchain wants to connect. Every corporation wants to be a router for this. And think of it like an airport, right? If you own one terminal, okay. But if every plane has to land on your runway, think about the amount of control that you have. Liquidity routing is going to work in the same exact way. If a CBDC has to settle across border, someone has to route it. If tokenized bonds come on chain, someone has to settle them. What about the FX market? If that goes digital, someone has to clear them. If treasuries want to actually move on chain, someone has to finalize DVP, delivery versus payment. There's not going to be 10 winners. There's not going to be 1,000 chains that are equally valued. Oh my God, I'm a socialist. There's going to be a handful. There's going to be a handful of standard networks that get plugged into one settlement layer. So yeah, 99% of assets, they don't stand a chance. They're not bad projects. It's not because institutions don't want to settle trillions of dollars. You want to know why institutions are not going to settle trillions of dollars on certain networks? Because they lack regulatory clarity. They lack auditability. They lack compliance tools. They lack identity frameworks. They lack messaging formats. They lack interoperability standards. DeFi degenerates think that permissionless is the future. You know what the institutions are thinking? They think that it's permissioned and compliance together. Permission and compliance equals scalability. And it's unfortunate because one side is really routing for freedom, but the other one wants finality. Right? Well, guess which one holds the liquidity? Billions in retail? That's fucking cute. We're talking trillions of dollars in the wholesale markets. When settlement becomes digital, the money that's involved is not crypto traders. Right? It's capital markets, it's FX, it's derivatives, it's trade finance. These markets dwarf crypto so brutally in comparison that it's not even close. Retail versus institutional money. It's not even close. People want to shout and cheer and clap when crypto volume hits $50 billion in a day. The banks move that before breakfast. Before you even wipe your ass in the morning and leave for work. The DTCC settles trillions of dollars daily, and nobody wants to talk about that. The big money's not here to chase the fastest, the meme coins, this. It's coming when the rails are ready. And what prepares the rails, right? What rails will be ready? The interoperability, the standards, the regulation, and that harmonized settlement. That's the finish line. Once that settlement architecture is chosen, once the institutions lock one liquidity routing standard, it's over. It is over because everyone has to plug into that winner. Just like you don't have 10 internet protocols, just like you don't have 10 global email formats. The world harmonized around one framework, and then scalability happens. So what is the end game? How do we actually get to the mass adoption, right? One global standard, one settlement architecture. Private and public rails are linked together. Regulations globally start to align. You have CBDCs that are interoperable. Liquidity routing. That's the moment that this entire system turns on. And they're all heading into one I guess end point, right? It's global harmonization. That's what we need. Global unity. The world is not going to run on fragmented systems forever. You can't have 20 different types of CBDCs that can't talk to each other. You can't have 10 different settlement networks competing forever. You can't have data standards and regulatory frameworks that are mismatched across all different countries. That's fucking chaotic. Global finance does not scale on chaos. You know how global finance scales? Compatibility, shared rules, shared rails, shared trust. Something uniformed. And we're in this in-between part between what's messy, right? The old system that we're watching being upgraded and this new system that's being railed. Everyone's experimenting. Everyone is trying to be the leader in this. But there's going to come a moment in every infrastructure transition where the experiments end and the standardization begins. Right? Blu-ray versus DVDs. TCP becoming universal, right? Swift becoming global. Not because there was only one option, but because they all agreed on the option. When ISO standards start to align, when CBDCs start to interoperate, when regulatory synchronization across all different regions start to unify, when we have settlement frameworks that start to unify, that's when you see that mass institutional adoption. And you'll be sitting here, right? The moments when everything felt slow and quiet and boring and technical and hidden, it'll become fucking explosive. It will become fucking explosive because mass adoption is not going to begin when retail gets excited. Mass adoption is going to begin when the institutions get certainty, when those rule books match the rails, when the compliance meets the connectivity, when the messaging standards meets the settlement standards, when the regulations meets the interoperability. That is when trillions of dollars unlock, not billions, trillions. That's when the liquidity floods, not trickles. When do you think the banks are going to stop piloting and start migrating? When do you think that the tokenization stops becoming a headline and it just becomes normal? That's when the world goes digital. You know what's funny? Like, some people think that adoption looks like the charts pump overnight and then the crypto influencers get online and they talk about it and then retail rushes into the exchanges. That's not at all how adoption works. You want to know how adoption actually works? Real adoption works? An ISO standard update, okay? CBDC interoperabilities. You have a regulatory green light, regulations. Central banks start to announce things. You have a new message mandate. Settlement networks really start to go live. Money's going to move differently. Banks are going to settle differently. Liquidity is going to be routed differently. Assets are going to trade differently. And by the time you pay attention, it's already going to be standardized. By the time the public sees it, these stupid motherfuckers, do you know a stupid motherfucker? Because I know a stupid motherfucker. By the time these stupid motherfuckers realize it, the architecture will already be decided. The winners would have already been chosen. The rails would have been built. The liquidity would have already been flowing. And you'll have one stupid motherfucker that'll go, how did I miss this? The same way that one stupid motherfucker said, how did I miss Google? How did I miss Apple? How did I miss Amazon? How did I miss Tesla? How did I miss Nvidia? How did I? Because you were distracted. I say that we're early or right on time, not because the price is still low, but because those standards globally have not synchronized with one another. We're still in this pre-alignment phase, the drafting phase, the silent war that's going on between regulations and standards. But when they finally unify, game over. Yes, I think it's important the United States has to get regulations. Yes, I think it's important the UK gets regulations and Asia. And I think it's all important that they all get the regulations. But on a global scale, they have to synchronize with one another. They have to harmonize. And when that finally happens, that's it. That's that activation moment. That's the mass institutional adoption. That's when blockchain is just normal. And only the networks that are compliant with global standards, aligns with ISO frameworks, interoperate with CBDCs, built for settlement and liquidity, make it into that final system. The rest don't get rugged. Not going to get rugged. They're just going to get ignored. That's what's going to happen. They're just going to get ignored. They become spectators, not athletes. The future's not going to choose them. The infrastructure certainly isn't going to need them. The institutions will never integrate in with them. Not because they failed or they were bad, but because they never fit into the global rule books. Choose infrastructure instead of the narrative. Choose the standards instead of the hype. Choose the rails instead of speculation. Choose the compliance instead of your animal coins. The people that are paying attention right now, the ones that are watching pilots and watching regulations draft and watching the ISO frameworks and the CBDC timelines, they don't care about the short-term price action. You know why? Because they're positioning themselves. And when the world finally comes together and operates on one digital standard, that liquidity gate is going to open like a dam. It's going to flood everything. The charts will go vertical. People are not going to be saying, if blockchain gets adopted, you know what they're going to be saying? How did anyone not see this? How did you miss this? So everything that we kind of walked through tonight, right? The standards, the CBDCs, the geopolitics, the private networks, the interoperability fights, the liquidity war that's going on. People will realize that crypto never was the goal, it was the infrastructure. It was never about what coin is pumping right now. It was never about who has the strongest community or never about the speculation. It was about who's building the rails that the world is going to run on. Because when those messaging standards become aligned, right? When those CBDCs become interoperable, when the regulations start to unify, when the private networks start to plug into global routing layers, that new financial system gets turned on. It gets turned on with policy updates. It gets turned on with standard adoption. You think the IMF, the BIS, the World Economic Forum, the central banks are asking for retail's permission? Which one do you guys like? Let's take a vote. It's not even going to tell you that it's coming, motherfucker. The ones that paid attention, the ones who followed the standards, the ones who understood the silent war of regulation and interoperability, they'll already be positioned. They will already be educated. They will already be aligned and positioned inside of the future rails. And you'll know one stupid motherfucker that'll wake up and say, how did I miss this? The networks that fit into the rulebook, those are the ones that are going to win. The rails that harmonize with one another, those are the ones that are going to survive 10, 15, 20 years. The tokens that are built for global finance, those are the ones that are going to win. Everything else will just get ignored. It's a standardization race. It's a regulatory race. It's a settlement race. It's a liquidity race. And the winner isn't the one with the fastest TPS. It's the one that the world is forced to use. The ones positioned, you guys, you don't need any luck. Maybe each one of us could use just a little bit more patience. We found the blueprint. We found the blueprint. Let it execute. Let it build. Let it marinate. When the world finally speaks one digital language, the liquidity flood is going to come in. That is your mass institutional adoption. That is inevitable. That is the silent war of standards and regulations. That is how global unity is going to lead to institutional adoption. Why are you not being direct, though? What a stupid fucking comment that was. I just spent an hour and a half being as blunt and as honest as I possibly could about what I really thought was going to happen. Why am I not being direct? Oh my God. Thank you, Derek. Yeah, look, this is just the way that I see it. This is from my research. This is from everything that I believe is going to happen. I'm paying attention to the regulations. I'm paying attention to the standards. I'm watching this institutional FOMO, this race for blockchain adoption. You should try to figure out if your assets will fit into this future or not. Those are the ones that are going to keep winning.